In 1955, an elderly woman named Elizabeth McClellan wrote to her city councilman by hand. Her rent was $24 a month, she told him, and it was too much, because her income came to less than $40. It is household arithmetic, done at a table by a woman who could not make the sum work. Near the top of Bunker Hill, a few streets from where she wrote it, the city kept an office where the people it removed came to sign. A clerk sat behind the counter with a form in front of him. The woman on the other side of the counter gave him her name, her room number, the rent she had been paying, and the address she said she was going to. Most of the people who came to that counter were old, and most of them paid about what Elizabeth McClellan paid, for a room with a bathroom down the hall. The most a family could be paid to leave was $200. A tenant who signed at that counter walked back out onto South Grand Avenue, halfway up the slope, into a place that was still, for a while longer, a neighborhood. Wooden porches with 6 mailboxes on them, palm trees leaning over retaining walls, a cable railway that carried you down to the market and back for a nickel. 8,000 people lived up there, in rooms cut out of houses that had been built for one family each. 136 acres. Within about 10 years, there was nothing left of it, and the ground it had stood on had been cut down and hauled away in trucks. The city had a reason, and the city wrote the reason down. Bunker Hill cost more in fire engines, police, and health inspectors than it returned in property tax. That was the finding, and California had passed a law that allowed a city to turn a finding like that into a taking. Not a slum clearance in the sense of condemning one dangerous building at a time. All of it, every parcel by right. One piece of the neighborhood came back. The cable railway was taken apart in the spring of 1969. Its 2 cars were stored in a private building downtown for 27 years, and it was rebuilt about 300 feet from where it used to run. What happened on it on the 1st of February 2001 is the last part of this story, and it is not a happy one. Almost every lost American neighborhood exists only in black and white. Bunker Hill was photographed in color, block by block, in the years it was being emptied. None of the arithmetic means very much until you know what it was counting. What it was counting was the most crowded neighborhood in Los Angeles, standing on the hill the Skyline now stands on. Elizabeth McClellan is in this story because she wrote a letter. Nobody wrote down where she went. In 1867, the hill was a dry lump of nothing on the western edge of a small town. There was no water on it. That single fact is why it was still empty while the flat land below it was being built on. And it is why 2 men were able to buy the whole thing. Prudent Beaudry had come to Los Angeles in 1852 from Lower Canada, run a general store, and turned to real estate in his 40s. He and Stephen Mott took the land in 1867, the ground between Hill Street and Olive Street from 2nd down to 4th falling to him, and the ground north and west of that to Mott. He hired a surveyor named George Hansen and had him cut the holding into 80 building lots. Then he solved the water, building the reservoir and the pipes that pushed it up the slope, because nobody would buy a lot on a hill where you had to carry your own. He went on to the city council in 1871 and served as mayor of Los Angeles from 1874 to 1876. He named the hill, most likely after the battle outside Boston, and the street that ran along the ridge carried that name for the next 100 years. Everything that happened later happened because of what he did to the water. A hill with pipes on it is an address, and an address in 1880 in Los Angeles meant the same thing it means now, which is that the people with money get the view. They arrived quickly. The Victorian houses that went up along the ridge in the 1880s were the largest private buildings in the city, and the men who built them were the ones assembling Los Angeles itself. Louis Bradbury, who had made a mining fortune in Mexico, and would leave behind the ornate office building downtown that carries his name. Judge Robert Whitney, who founded the University of Southern California and pushed the first street railway through the town. Louis John Rose, who came overland with a wagon train and turned a stretch of the San Gabriel Valley into a wine and horse operation. Dr. Edmund Hildreth, a retired clergyman, whose house on the hill was photographed so often that it became shorthand for the whole district. 2 of the houses are worth holding on to, because both of them come back at the end. At 325 South Bunker Hill Avenue, somebody built a Queen Anne so elaborate that people simply called it the Castle. Next door but one, at 339, stood a plain New England box with a steep back roof, out of place among all the turrets, which people called the Salt Box. Dr. A.G. Cook lived in it for most of the 1880s. Around them, the hill filled with the buildings a rich district needs, hotels called the Melrose, the Belmont, and the Richelieu. A German Protestant congregation that put up a church on South Olive Street and, next door to it, the German Deaconess Hospital, which opened its doors on the 8th of February, 1904. Bankers, doctors, and lawyers walked to work in the town below. Walk down, that is. The climb back up was the problem, and the problem was about to produce the most photographed object in the history of Los Angeles. A cable railway ran on 2nd Street already, put there to help with the grade. It was not enough. In 1901, Colonel James Ward Eddy, a lawyer and an engineer, petitioned the city council for permission to build an inclined railway from Hill Street up to Olive Street, a distance of less than 300 feet on a slope of 33%. Approval came 10 days later, with the signature of Mayor Meredith Snyder on it, which tells you something about how Los Angeles handled infrastructure in 1901. Eddy built 2 counterweighted cars on a shared cable and named them Sinai and Olivet, after 2 hills in scripture. A ride cost a penny at first. The whole trip took under a minute. Angel's Flight was never really transport in any serious sense, since it saved a walk of 1 steep block, but it was the walk that mattered to a woman carrying groceries up from the market on Hill Street, and it ran for 68 years without ever pretending to be anything grander than that. A second incline went up on the far side of the ridge in 1905, the work of Samuel Vandegrift, on 2 parallel tracks at a grade of 53%, very likely the steepest passenger railway anywhere in the world. Court Flight carried people for 39 years, stopped running in 1943, and almost nobody remembers it. The city kept cutting at the hill to get around it. A tunnel was driven through for 3rd Street in 1901. Another was driven for 2nd Street in 1924. The Pacific Electric ran its subway under the ridge in 1925. Each one made the hill slightly less of an obstacle and slightly more of an island, a raised block of Victorian houses with the modern city flowing through tunnels underneath it. The tunnels also made it easy to leave, and in the 1920s, the people with money started to. They went to Beverly Hills, to Pasadena, to the flat new tracks where a car could be parked at the door. A 20-room house on a hill with no garage and 100 stairs to the street was, by then, a difficult thing to sell to anybody who could afford it new. So the houses did what large houses always do when the money leaves. They were divided. The castle was cut into 15 separate units as early as 1902. Others followed through the 20s and 30s, a ballroom becoming 3 rooms, a servant stair becoming the only stair, a bathroom at the end of each corridor for everybody on that floor. The city's building files filled with the paperwork of subdivision. Nobody was ashamed of it, it was ordinary. What it produced was cheap housing in walking distance of the center of a booming city, which is the rarest commodity any city has ever had. The population of the hill went up by roughly 19%. Bunker Hill became the most crowded piece of ground in Los Angeles, and the people who filled it were pensioners, cannery workers, seasonal laborers, retired railroad men, widows, and immigrants who had arrived with nothing. That transformation is the whole of the argument that came later. The hill did not fail. It changed clients, and the new clients were people the city would eventually decide it could not afford. Margaret Henderson came out to Los Angeles from Indiana with her family in the 1920s and arrived in the city herself in 1932. Her mother worked as a building manager at the Colonial Arms on South Grand. Her brother Willis bought the Salt Box. Her brother Lawrence owned an apartment building called the Crest Home. Margaret leased the castle in 1937 and bought it outright in 1942, and by then, she was running more than 60 units on the hill. The Crest Home is the first thing this family lost, and it went 5 years before the council vote and 9 years before the first agency demolition. In 1954, the city drove the 4th Street extension through the hill, and Lawrence Henderson's building was in the trench. There was no redevelopment plan involved and no finding of blight. It was a road widening, of the sort every American city was doing that decade, and it took an apartment building full of people because the grade required it. That is worth holding on to through everything that follows. Before Los Angeles decided the hill was a problem to be solved, it had already been cutting pieces off the hill for 40 years to make the traffic work, and nobody on the hill had ever been able to stop any of it. Margaret Henderson did not live to see any of that. She died in 1943, and the property passed to her son. She had owned the house outright for 1 year. A tenant in the front room named Ollie Harp took over the day-to-day management. That is the shape of the place in one family. An Indiana family who came west with nothing much, ran rooming houses on a hill, and were the landlords, the managers, and the tenants all at once. Her grandson, Gordon Pattison, spent his weekends up there helping with the maintenance. He is the reason a lot of this is known, because he remembered it precisely and spent decades telling anyone who would listen. He described the soundtrack of the neighborhood as pigeons cooing, the rustle of palm branches, and the occasional siren from down below. He remembered Angel's Flight as a thrill ride, and remembered that you got all of that adventure for a nickel. A Pepsi at the deli was a dime. In the census of 1940, 92% of the castle's immediate neighbors had been born outside California. About 16% had been born outside the United States, in France, Germany, England, Finland, Poland, Turkey, and Iceland. Those numbers describe an immigrant quarter within a short walk of City Hall, and it lasted for another 20 years. While Gordon Pattison was carrying paint up those stairs, a word was being written about his grandmother's neighborhood in offices at the bottom of the hill. The word was Blight, and it had recently acquired a legal meaning. California passed the Community Redevelopment Law in 1945. The Federal Housing Acts of 1946 and 1949 put money behind it. Los Angeles created its Community Redevelopment Agency in 1948. Together, those three things built a machine with one function. And it is worth stating the function plainly, because the language used at the time was designed to make it hard to see. Here is how the machine worked. A city agency surveys an area and declares it blighted. That declaration is a legal finding, not a description. Once the finding is made, the agency may buy every parcel inside the boundary, using eminent domain against anybody who will not sell. It clears what it has bought. It then sells the cleared ground to private developers, and it may sell it for less than the ground cost to acquire, with the public covering the gap. The word blight is doing an enormous amount of work in that sequence. It is the trigger that converts a neighborhood into a real estate assembly. In 1955, the City Health Department declared Bunker Hill a health hazard. A survey taken in December of that year graded 4 in 10 of the buildings extremely substandard and fewer than 2 in 10 acceptable. A second survey, taken in April of 1957, put 6 in 10 of the structures in the dangerous category. Those numbers are real, and they describe real conditions. Rooming houses converted out of wooden mansions 50 years earlier, with shared plumbing and no fire separation, were dangerous, and the people living in them knew it better than the surveyors did. But a survey answers only the question it was asked, and nobody at any point asked what it would cost to repair them. There was another set of figures, and this is the set that explains the decision. When the whole thing eventually reached the California Supreme Court, the city's justification was laid out in the record. Bunker Hill cost the city about $754,101 a year in fire, police, and health services. In 1957, the district returned $106,120 in taxes. Set those two numbers against each other and you have the argument. Roughly $7 going out for every dollar coming in. Not a housing argument, a ledger. There is an obvious objection to using that ledger, and it is worth saying out loud. The reason the district produced so little tax was that its buildings were old, its assessments were low, and its residents were poor. The reason it consumed so much service was that 8,000 people were living on it. The ledger, read honestly, is a description of a dense working-class neighborhood in the middle of an expensive city. Read the way the agency read it, it is a case for removal. That is what blight meant on Bunker Hill. Stripped of the legal language, the finding was that the people living there did not generate enough tax to justify the land they were standing on. Elizabeth McClellan wrote her letter that same year, and it is the other side of that ledger. One woman, one rent, one pension, set against a column of service costs. Multiply her by several thousand, and you have the actual population of Bunker Hill in the middle 1950s. Old age pensions, disability payments, marginal work. The planning documents of the period said so directly. The problem of moving and rehousing those people was described as the chief stumbling block to any redevelopment program for Bunker Hill. Not a moral problem, a stumbling block. There is a film of them, which is a strange piece of luck. In 1961, the director Kent Mackenzie released The Exiles, a feature shot on Bunker Hill with a cast of young Native Americans who were actually living there, having left reservations under the federal relocation programs of the 1950s. They play themselves across one night on the hill, in the bars, on the stairs, up at the top of Angel's Flight. It is a film about people who had already been relocated once, made in a neighborhood that was about to relocate them again, and nobody involved in making it seems to have found that ironic at the time. 4 years before that film was shot, the machinery had already been assembled. What it needed was a vote. The Los Angeles City Council adopted the Bunker Hill Urban Renewal Project on the 31st of March, 1959. The project area covered 136 acres. The public case made for it was that the city had to keep from slipping backward, in the words used at the time, like San Francisco and New York in the population race. The fight leading up to that vote was not the one you would expect. It was not preservationists against developers. There were three sides, and all three of them wanted the neighborhood gone. The liberal reformers wanted Bunker Hill cleared and rebuilt as middle-income apartment housing, so that ordinary families could live in the center of the city. The pro-redevelopment side wanted luxury high-rise apartments, office towers, hotels, parking structures, and a civic trade plaza. And the third side, the landlords who actually owned property on the hill, opposed both of those plans, because both of them ended with their rental income gone. The tenants, who were the only group with nothing to gain from any version, had no organization and no vote in the room. The reformers lost. The plan that was adopted allowed the cleared land to be transferred to private developers below market value, and the housing that was supposed to arrive for the people being moved was pushed off the hill entirely. In the planning of the period, the proposed answer to where Bunker Hill's residents would go was another neighborhood a mile and a half to the north, in a set of canyons called Chavez Ravine, which was to be cleared and rebuilt first so that it could take them. Anybody who knows what happened at Chavez Ravine knows how much housing for displaced people was eventually built there. A baseball stadium opened on that ground in 1962. The reason nothing was waiting is a separate fight that had finished 6 years before the Bunker Hill vote, and Bunker Hill cannot honestly be explained without it. The Federal Housing Act of 1949 had authorized a large public housing program, and Los Angeles signed up for 10,000 units of it. The city's housing authority planned the largest single piece in the canyons at Chavez Ravine, a development called Elysian Park Heights, laid out by one of the best-known modernist architects working in California. 24 buildings of 13 stories, more than 162-story houses, playgrounds and schools between them. Whatever anybody thought of the design, it was several thousand homes with rents a pensioner could pay, being built 4 miles from Bunker Hill at the exact moment Bunker Hill was being surveyed for clearance. The real estate industry and the city's largest newspaper set out to kill it, and they did not argue about architecture. They argued that public housing was socialism, and in Los Angeles in 1952, that argument did not need to be good. The man who took the weight of it was Frank Wilkinson, the assistant director of the City Housing Authority and the program's chief public advocate. On the 18th of May, 1953, during proceedings over the Ravine land, the chief of the Los Angeles Police Department, William Parker, read aloud from an FBI file which asserted that Wilkinson had been an active member of the Communist Party in Los Angeles for many years. Wilkinson was asked about his political associations. He declined to answer. He was fired. He was later called before the House Un-American Activities Committee, refused again on First Amendment grounds, was convicted of contempt of Congress, and served time in a federal prison. He had spent his career trying to get poor people into decent buildings, and the case that ended his career was made by a police chief with a dossier. Nothing in that dossier concerned the buildings. That same year, the voters approved a measure against the housing plan and elected a new mayor, Norris Polson, who had campaigned on stopping it. The program was canceled. Los Angeles had signed up for 10,000 units of public housing, and the largest single block of them was never built. By 1958, the city had conveyed the Ravine land to a baseball team. Here is the sequence set out plainly. Los Angeles destroyed the public housing program that could have rehoused Bunker Hill in 1953 and voted to clear Bunker Hill in 1959. The two decisions were taken by the same city, 6 years apart, and only one of them was ever presented to the public as a decision about poor people. What stood between the agency and the neighborhood was now nothing except a group of property owners with lawyers. They fought for 5 years. Between 1959 and 1961, the agency won a run of cases in the lower courts, and the objectors kept appealing, and the whole question of whether Los Angeles could take 136 acres of occupied city from its owners arrived at the California Supreme Court. The decision came down on the 27th of February, 1964. The objectors included a man named Henry Goldman and the Briggs Apartment Hotel Company, among others, and the portion of the project argued over most closely covered parts of 5 blocks between the Harbor Freeway and Olive Street, from 4th Street up to 2nd, about 23 acres of the total. The court reviewed the health survey, the building survey, the crime figures, and the cost of servicing the district, and it held that the redevelopment of blighted areas is a public use. Public use is the phrase that matters because it is the phrase in the Fifth Amendment. Land can be taken from an unwilling owner for a public use. A road is a public use. A reservoir is a public use. What the court confirmed in 1964 is that clearing a neighborhood and selling the ground to a private developer is also a public use, provided a public agency has first found the neighborhood to be blighted. That finding did not only settle Bunker Hill, it settled the method. Every parcel on the hill was now available to the agency at a price a court would set, whether the owner agreed or not. What the agency did to the buildings after that is the part of this story people know. What it did afterwards has no equivalent anywhere else in the United States. The demolition had actually begun before the court ruled. The first structure the agency took down was an apartment building called the Hillcrest at 3rd and Olive, raised in September of 1961. After that, it moved block by block. The relocation office opened, and the process at the counter was the one the tenants came to know. A caseworker recorded who you were and what you paid. You were given help finding somewhere else, which in practice meant a list. A family could receive up to $200 towards the cost of moving. For a woman paying $24 a month on a pension of under $40, the list was the problem, because nothing in the surrounding blocks rented at Bunker Hill prices. Bunker Hill was cheap precisely because its buildings were old and its owners had stopped investing, and every building in that condition within walking distance was being cleared by the same agency at the same time. 7,310 housing units were demolished. More than 8,000 people were moved out. There was no requirement that they be rehoused anywhere in particular, and no public record follows most of them to wherever they went. In the autumn of 1964, a chain-link fence went up around the castle at 325 South Bunker Hill Avenue. The last tenants were evicted. The agency took the property that Margaret Henderson Pattison had leased in 1937 and bought in 1942, and that her family had run for 27 years. Gordon Pattison went up to look at it. The leaded glass in the front door had been boarded over with plywood. The crescent moon window above the door was gone. Of the chandelier in the hall, a few dusty beads were still hanging. The house was standing and empty, and no longer theirs. What he took away from that house was the account of it. The Crest home had gone in 1954 for a road. The castle went in 1964 for a plan. The 60-odd units his grandmother had run, the tenant who managed them after she died, the rents and the repairs and the weekends spent carrying paint up those stairs, all of it became a file at an agency and then nothing at all. He spent the decades that followed describing the place to anybody who would listen, in interviews and in recorded oral histories, and what he described was almost never the architecture. It was the ordinary business of a family who owned rooming houses and lived in them at the same time, which is a thing that has no monument anywhere in Los Angeles and did not have one then. The reason so much of this can be checked against a picture is that the clearance paid for the photography. Leonard Nadell worked as a photographer for the Housing Authority and then documented the blocks the Community Redevelopment Agency had marked, and he went through Bunker Hill building by building. A survey photograph of a sagging porch is an argument for clearance. A photograph of the family sitting on that porch is an argument against it, and Nadell took both kinds, often on the same afternoon. The commercial photographer George Mann shot the same streets in color. Almost every other lost neighborhood in the United States exists only in gray. Bunker Hill exists in the actual paint colors the landlords used. What happened next was not just to the buildings, it was to the hill. Clearing a neighborhood leaves you with an empty neighborhood. Los Angeles did not want an empty neighborhood. It wanted a site, and a site on a steep Victorian hill is not a site at all, because the streets are on the wrong grades for towers. The parking has nowhere to go, and the whole raised block is cut off from the flat downtown around it. So the agency removed the hill. Steam shovels took roughly 30 feet off the summit and carried it away. The land was pared down 2 stories in places. Streets that had existed for 90 years were not rerouted or renamed, but simply deleted. And Clay Street and Bunker Hill Avenue, the street the whole district had been named for, no longer exist anywhere in Los Angeles. Olive Street now runs several stories below the level it ran at when Elizabeth McClellan was writing her letter. The ground is not the ground. If you stand on Bunker Hill now, the surface under your feet is about 30 feet lower than the surface the castle stood on, and the difference left the city in trucks. That is the part of this story that has no equivalent anywhere else in the United States. Cities demolish neighborhoods regularly. There is a long and well-documented list of them. Los Angeles demolished the neighborhood and then removed the landform underneath it, so that the evidence is not buried under the new buildings, but has been physically carted off in trucks. Angel's Flight was in the way. It was closed in the middle of May 1969 after 68 years of continuous operation. The cars Sinai and Olivet were dismantled and put into storage in a private building downtown, along with the station arch, on the understanding that they would go back up when the new Bunker Hill was finished. They sat there for 27 years. 2 houses got out. They are the 2 you already know. The Salt Box, at 339 South Bunker Hill Avenue, had been made Historic Cultural Monument No. 5 in August of 1962, on the first day the city's Cultural Heritage Board was in operation. Number 5. The board had existed for a matter of hours, and it had already been forced to start listing Bunker Hill. The plain little house had also become slightly famous. The photographer Guy Webster shot it in 1967, and it appeared on the cover of the blues musician Taj Mahal's first album in 1968, which is why a house on a doomed street in Los Angeles is sitting in record collections all over the world. Both the Salt Box and the castle were scheduled for demolition on the 1st of October 1968. They were saved. The Recreation and Parks Commission voted to let them stand on city land up in Highland Park, and the Department of Public Works agreed to move them there, to a site that became the Heritage Square Museum. In March of 1969, they were jacked up, put on trailers, and driven several miles north. In October of 1969, about 7 months after the move, both houses burned to the ground. The fire was set. The Los Angeles Times reported that after the move, the empty houses had been used for parties by vandals and youths, and that they were invaded before the arson that destroyed them. 2 of the oldest houses in Los Angeles were rescued from a bulldozer, driven across the city, left standing unguarded on a vacant lot, and burned by somebody nobody ever identified. It was also the last thing the Henderson family ever owned. That was the preservation's success story. While that was happening, one man was still living on the hill. Stuart Oliver had built a modern house at 4th and Hope on a lot of 7,940 square feet, and he and his wife moved into it in 1949. It was not a Victorian. It was a low, flat-roofed, contemporary house, the kind of thing a confident person built in Los Angeles after the war, and it sat among the turrets like a wristwatch in a drawer of pocket watches. In 1954, the steam shovels arrived to trench 4th Street beneath his property, extending the road through the hill. He stayed. When the agency began offering owner participation agreements, which allowed an existing owner to redevelop his own parcel inside the plan instead of selling out, Oliver took it seriously and proposed to build 150 apartments on his land. Then the agency revised the master plan later in the 1960s, and modest apartment buildings were written out of it in favor of towers of 50 stories. There was no longer a category in the plan that Stuart Oliver's proposal could fit into. Through the summer of 1969, the bulldozers cleared everything around him, and the shovels cut the ground down on all 4 sides. His house ended up standing on an earthen stump, 2 stories above the new grade, reached by a ramp, with the whole cleared plateau of the hill spread out beyond it. He sold in July of 1969 for $500,000, which is the one number in this entire story that went to a resident rather than a developer. By 1970, the house and the stump were both gone. The site became Security Pacific Plaza, 55 stories of it. The people are harder to follow than the buildings, but not impossible, because they mostly did not go far. A tenant pushed off Bunker Hill in the middle 1960s had one realistic option, which was a residential hotel a few blocks east, in the district the city calls Skid Row. Those buildings were the same product Bunker Hill had been selling. A room, a bed, a shared bathroom, a rent an old man could pay out of a pension check. By the late 1960s, there were about 15,000 of those units down there. Within roughly a decade, half of them were gone. Some failed fire and safety codes, and the owners found demolition cheaper than repair, which is the same arithmetic the Bunker Hill landlords had run 20 years earlier. Some were cleared under the same anti-blight campaigns, with inspectors writing violations until the owners walked away. 7,500 rooms, removed from the only part of Los Angeles where a poor man could still rent one. Of the 6,500 rooms that survived, roughly 3,500 were later bought up, rehabilitated, or replaced by non-profit operators, which is real work and not a gesture. It began a generation after the people who needed it were moved. In the 1970s, the city arrived at what it called containment. Stripped of the word, containment meant drawing a boundary on a map, agreeing that the services and the cheap rooms and the people who needed them would stay inside it. and agreeing that the rest of downtown would be developed without them. It was a compromise between investors who wanted the poor moved and advocates who wanted them housed. And what it produced is the geography of Skid Row that exists in Los Angeles to this day. So the honest answer to where the 8,000 went is that most of them went downhill, into a housing stock that was itself half demolished inside 10 years, inside a boundary the city drew to keep them still. Nobody followed them with a clipboard. The relocation files recorded where a tenant said they were going, not where they ended up. The new Bunker Hill arrived slowly, and it did not look like the drawings. The first new housing on the hill went up in 1968. Bunker Hill Tower, 32 stories, designed by Robert Evans Alexander, 256 apartments. The agency had demolished 7,310. Union Bank Plaza was finished the same year, the first modern tower on the hill, and after it came the Westin Bonaventure Hotel in January of 1977. 5 mirrored cylinders with a lobby that visitors have been failing to navigate ever since. And then 2 California Plaza at the highest surviving point of the ridge, 52 stories of it. The museum on Grand Avenue arrived by a route that says more about how the new hill was assembled than the building itself does. In 1979, the agency brokered a deal with the partnership developing California Plaza. The developers got the use of 11 acres of publicly owned ground. In exchange, the deal carried a museum, the Museum of Contemporary Art, built at a cost of about $23 million, funded in part through a rule requiring 1.5% of the budget of a Bunker Hill development to be spent on public art. Its permanent building opened in the 1980s, and it is one of the best small museums in the country. Set that against what the same agency was able to require 20 years earlier. When the city handed a private partnership 11 acres of public land, it obtained a museum, a plaza, a water feature, and a public art budget written into the contract. When the city removed 8,000 people from the same ground, it obtained a list of vacancies and a moving allowance. Both of those were the same agency exercising the same powers. The difference is only in who was on the other side of the table. There is a photograph in that museum's permanent collection, cataloged under the title Rooming House, Bunker Hill, Los Angeles. It is one of the ordinary buildings the clearance took, hanging as art inside an institution that exists because the clearance happened, on the ground where the building stood. Nobody arranged that. It is the kind of thing that accumulates when a city removes a neighborhood and then spends 40 years deciding the neighborhood was interesting. The wide stairway beside the library, 60 feet across, was designed by Lawrence Halprin at the end of the 1980s, with a Robert Graham figure standing in the water at the top of it from 1992. And in 1980, on the ground where the rooming houses had been, something else opened that belongs in this story precisely because it complicates it. Angeles Plaza is 5 towers of 1-bedroom apartments for older adults, 1,093 of them built and run by the nonprofit Retirement Housing Foundation. It was the largest development of its kind in the country, and it is still there, on Bunker Hill, occupied by exactly the demographic that was cleared off the hill 20 years earlier. A later refurbishment was funded partly through tax credits and $96 million in tax-exempt state bonds arranged through the redevelopment agency. So the honest version of the account has to include this. Housing for poor older people was eventually built on Bunker Hill, in quantity, and it is a serious building program, not a token. What it was not was rehousing. It opened 16 years after the fence went up around the castle, and there was no mechanism by which the woman paying $24 a month in 1955 could have waited for it. She was moved in the 1960s, to somewhere nobody wrote down, and the clearance was not finished with the hill. It had another 20 years left to run up there, and the last building it took was not a rooming house at all. In May of 1988, the German Methodist Congregation's church on South Olive Street, the building whose cornerstone had been laid in 1910 and which had been dedicated in July of 1911, was sold to the developers assembling the block. It was demolished in November of that year. The site is now part of the footprint of the gas company tower. The congregation carried its stained glass and its cornerstone to a new church in Glendale. 29 years after the vote, the clearance of Bunker Hill was still finishing, which leaves the railway. In the 1990s, the pieces came out of storage, and on the 24th of February, 1996, Angel's Flight opened again, about 300 feet south of where Colonel Eddy had put it. Same cars, restored. Same names on them, Sinai and Olivet. It ran between a plaza at the top and Hill Street at the bottom, and it was immediately what it had always been, which is the only thing on Bunker Hill that anybody photographs on purpose. On the 1st of February 2001, the car Sinai was climbing when it stopped, reversed, and ran back down the track out of control. It struck Olivet near the lower station. Leon Praport, who was 83 years old, was killed. His wife Lola was injured, along with 7 other people. The National Transportation Safety Board found that the probable cause was the improper design and construction of the funicular drive, together with the failure of the various regulatory bodies to ensure that the railway met the safety standards it was supposed to meet. The rebuilt railway had been assembled without the safety redundancy a funicular is meant to carry, and no agency had checked. It stayed shut for 9 years. It reopened on the 15th of March, 2010, at 50 cents a ride, and carried more than 59,000 passengers in its first month back. On the 5th of September 2013, a car derailed again near the middle of the track. Investigators found a safety system had been deliberately bypassed. It stayed shut for another 4 years and returned to service on the 31st of August 2017 under a 30-year agreement with a private consortium to rehabilitate, operate, and maintain it. Los Angeles tore down Bunker Hill because a ledger said the people living on it cost the city $7 for every dollar they returned, and because the law of 1945 let the city convert that sentence into a title deed. Every other explanation that gets offered is downstream of that. The fire risk was real, and nobody costed the repairs. The buildings were old, and nobody asked the owners to fix them. The crime rate was cited in court, and the court accepted it. But the instrument that was actually used was a finding of blight. And blight was a word for an area whose assessed value was too low for the ground it occupied. Once that finding existed, the outcome was not a policy choice any longer. It was a procedure, and it ran for a decade until there was nothing left to process. Stand at the top of the stairway beside the Central Library and look up the slope. The tower line above you is the financial center of the western United States. Beneath your feet, about 30 feet of hill that used to be there is not there. Walk north along Grand past the museum and the concert hall and the white building with the honeycomb front, the one named for Eli Broad, and you are walking on a graded shelf where 325 South Bunker Hill Avenue used to stand. Bunker Hill Avenue itself is not there to walk on. It was not renamed. It was removed. A few things did survive. The people who have documented this ground most closely report a retaining wall from a hotel of 1902 still holding up a corner at 4th and Olive, which means a piece of masonry built to stop a hillside falling into the street is now holding back a hillside that is not there. The tunnels are still under the ridge. A half moon of decorative glass from the castle's front door turned up years later in private hands. At the university, an archive team has been rebuilding the neighborhood in 3 dimensions out of the survey photographs and the oral histories, including Gordon Pattison's, which as of 2026 is the only place it exists at full size. Nobody was prosecuted for any of this, because nothing about it was illegal. Every step was taken in public by an elected council, upheld by the state's highest court, funded by a federal program, and reported in the newspapers as progress. The tenants were not cheated. They were counted, valued, and found to be worth less than the ground. And the railway runs. It was running in May of 2025, the last time its operators published a schedule, and it has been running on and off for 124 years. It has been dismantled once and closed twice. It killed a passenger, and it carries tourists up a slope that is no longer the slope it was built for. It is the last working piece of a neighborhood of 8,000 people. It is 300 feet from where it started. It is 30 feet lower than it used to be. Sinai still goes up as Olivet comes down, and neither of them has ever gone anywhere else. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to hit the subscribe button in the middle to watch more forgotten places and abandoned history from across America. Then click the video on the left to watch similar stories like this. Or if you really want to get stuck in, click the playlist on the right. New videos every week. I'll see you in the next one.